my name is Dupsy, and I will be moderating the webinar today. And I want to say a massive welcome to everybody. Like I said, my name is Dupsy, and I'm a domestic abuse officer with 8 years working experience with women and children fleeing domestic abuse. I work with Look Ahead in the Women's Refuge, advising, supporting, and advocating for women and children from diverse backgrounds. There are more other things I do, so if you want to know more about me, you can go to the website in the speakers forum, and then you'll see more about me. Thank you. This event, Protection Against Stalking and Cyberstalking, is a part of 16 days of action to end gender-based violence. Kent Integrated Domestic Abuse Service have 16 events running between now and 10th December to inform, educate, and inspire action so that we can make domestic abuse everybody's business. Because domestic abuse is everybody's business and everyone can make a difference, which is just what you're doing by attending today. Thank you. During the event, you are able to use the QA text box on your screen to ask questions for Sue Dunn and Jan Berry, which I can see many people are already doing. As moderator, I will publish this and ask them at the end of the session. Sue Dunn will be speaking for approximately 30 minutes alongside Jan, and will then have 30 minutes for questions. I just want you to know that your email confirmations show the webinar as slightly longer, so we don't get cut off on the system. You can use the thumbs up just underneath a question to upvote if that's something you would like us to ask. If you would like to follow up on a question, please preface the questions with the words follow up. So that just leaves me with a wonderful job of introducing these wonderful women. The first person I'll be introducing you today is Sue Dunn. Let me say a few words about Sue. Sue Dunn is a retired police officer who is the co-CEO of Protection Against Stalking. Previously, Sue was the chief executive of DAVS, the West Kent award-winning charity supporting victims of domestic abuse. Sue has received numerous awards and commendation for her work in the domestic abuse arena, authoring and co-authoring related manuals, policies, and procedures. Having qualified as a trainer, Sue designs, develops, and delivers bespoke training packages relating to domestic and sexual violence, stalking, safeguarding of children, and vulnerable adults. She also developed a training program for a church congregation, enabling them to respond to victims of domestic abuse and create an environment where victims felt able to disclose. Sue is an accredited IDVA and ISVA. IDVA means Independent Domestic Abuse Advisor and Independent Sexual Violence Advisor. Sue coordinated the establishment of MARAC. MARAC is Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference across Kent and Medway, and the operation of the West Kent area MARAC in partnership with the Cyber Helpline. Sue has established a cyber stalking clinic in Kent, bringing together experts on cyber stalking to support victims of stalking. Just for you to be aware, I worked under Sue for up to 5 years, and most of my domestic abuse training can be credited to Sue. Thank you, Sue. The next wonderful woman I will be introducing to you is Jan Berry. Jan Berry is the former chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales and first female to be elected to the role in the 100 years history of the Police Federation. As chair, she gained a reputation for being professional, balanced, and a free thinker. Jan joined Kent County Constabulary as a cadet in 1971, retiring 37 years later as a chief inspector, having gained experience in a variety of posts, from beat officer to detective. Jan introduced Juvenile Liaison Bureau and Rape Victim Suites in Kent and was a key member of the team that launched the crime prevention initiative, Secured by Design. Jan became chief negotiator for all officers from constable to chief constable across the UK. Jan's work in policing was recognized in 2006 when she received the Queen's Police Medal. Following retirement, Jan was appointed by the Home Secretary to cut red tape across government and policing. Today, Jan advises on operational policing, reducing bureaucracy in the criminal justice system, and transformational change. Jan is a chair of governors at Sevenoaks Preparatory School, a trustee with DAVS, the West Kent Domestic Abuse Charity, and co-CEO of the charity Protection Against Stalking. So you can see that we've got two wonderful women with us today. Like I said, I will advise you to begin to put your question and answer together in the chat box for me to publish them. So I would just like you to know also that in case you have anything to chat with someone about, or you have, you know, something to talk about, or it disturbs you, kindly use your private message to message anyone, and we'll be happy to respond to you. And also there'll be a pop-up number now in case you need to get in touch with any professionals. And you will see the number pop up now. That's the 0808 1689 111, and you can visit that website. And there will be help at the other side for you. So I will be going away for a while, and I'll be back. And I'll be leaving you in these safe hands of these two wonderful women. Thank you, and see you in a minute.
Thank you, Dupsy. On behalf of Sue and I, and thank you also to Kaidas for inviting Protection Against Stalking to be part of this conference. It's a great initiative, and we're really delighted to be here. What we want to do this morning, or this afternoon, is I want to start by telling you a little bit about Protection Against Stalking, how we started, and what the issues are that we're trying to address. And then Sue's going to come in, and the professional person that she is, she's going to tell you a little bit about stalking as an offence, and particularly around cyberstalking as well. So where did it all start? It all started for Protection Against Stalking 10 years ago. The lady you can see on your screen is a lady called Clare Bernal, and sadly her murder became infamous. Claire was murdered on the floor of Harvey Nichols in London, and right across the newspapers. Claire had been going out with her murderer, Michael Pesh, for about 3 weeks, during which time he became totally obsessed with her. And unfortunately, in the aftermath, nobody really realised that she was being stalked. And Claire's mum is a lady called Tricia Bernal, who lives in Tunbridge Wells. Claire was brought up in Tunbridge Wells and went to school there. And Tricia, after Claire's death, was one of quite a few ladies and parents who take total tragedy in their own lives and turn it to some good. Claire kept on meeting other mothers and other fathers who were facing the same that she was facing. And so Tricia, together with another mother whose daughter had also been murdered by an ex-stalker, set up Protection Against Stalking in 2010. Now, at that point, very few people really understood stalking. Very little legislation dealt with it. So the first thing the charity did was it set up a national stalking helpline, which today is still run by the Susie Lampley Trust. It then turned its eyes on trying to get the legislation better. And so in double quick time, they got 2 new pieces of legislation in the Protection Against Harassment Act. Then it turned its eyes on trying to get training right and doing other things. And then to a certain extent, it sort of lost its way after that. And then Sue and I were asked if we would come and assist. And what we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years is really trying to do what's so important to Protection Against Stalking, which is really raising awareness of stalking and providing support to those people who are in difficulty from it. So the good old statistics, and I think some of these are really quite frightening. 9 out of 10 murdered women have been stalked. That comes from some research undertaken by a lady called Jane Monckton Smith. Sue will probably refer to it a little bit later. But Jane Monckton Smith, who actually is a former police officer, is also a professor at Gloucester University. And she researched about just over 300 murders. And that's the statistic. If you look back into it, you can see that they've been stalked. And also you can see in different stages of those particular cases, it could and should have been stopped beforehand. 54% of stalking cases are linked to domestic abuse, which tells us that 46% haven't. And so that's a really important statistic. 1 in 5 women, 1 in 10 men will be stalked at some point during their lifetime. And another scary statistic is 100 stalking incidents will be experienced before anybody reports it. And in many cases, the victims are the last to know that they are being stalked. And not only does it affect the victim, it affects people around them as well. And Sue will talk a little bit about this later too. Not all stalking offences involve violence, but some do. And the other statistics, which I find really frightening, is 80% of stalking victims will display symptoms of PTSD. Now that can be between a range, but even so, there's huge cost to themselves individually and to society, because they will stay off work, they will move home, some people even move country to get away from the stalker. Oops, I've just gone back. Let me just go back, sorry. Another frightening statistic. According to the Office of National Statistics, 1.47 million people were stalked last year, between April 18 and March 19. That's quite frightening. 39,000 of those were recorded in England and Wales as stalking. 472,000 were recorded as stalking and harassment. But what that really tells Sue and I is that there's an awful lot of stalking offences which are happening, which are not being reported. And some of those which are being reported are not necessarily being recorded as stalking. And what is really important is both for the victim to make sure they get the right protections, and from the perpetrator to make sure they get the right treatments. It's really important that stalking is identified early on and the correct interventions are put in place early on. In Kent recorded last year just over 1,000 stalking offences. And I have to say that it has improved significantly, and we're seeing more and more offences recorded as stalking that should be. That said, I have no doubt that there are a lot of cases which are being recorded as harassment, which should in reality be stalking. What do our clients tell us about what's happening to them? And I think this really goes back to people not understanding stalking and understanding the behaviours that could account for stalking. No one gets it. No one wants to listen. I'm not being taken seriously. They think it's a joke. I'm frightened. They don't realise what it's doing to me and my family. And when you look at what some people will do because they are being stalked, how they try and cope with it, how they try and move themselves out of circumstances where it's having an effect on them, you can see how important it is that not only do the victims recognise it, but those people around the victims. I do a lot of presentations, and it is very, very rare that I do any presentation where somebody doesn't come up to me at the end and say, I've been a victim of stalking. I didn't realise, and this is what's happened. And I also realise that there will be people who are listening today who will have been the victims of stalking, or will know somebody who's the victims of stalking. And that's why it's terribly important that you understand what stalking is, and also where you can go to for help. You know, if you're scared, if you are petrified or frightened, you dial 999. And if you're not, there are so many people like Protection Against Stalking who are out there for you. When Tricia Bernal asked Sue and I to help Protection Against Stalking, but what we very clearly became aware of is that in many cases there was no local support for people who are victims of stalking. And we really believe that every victim of stalking should have the support and the protection they need, including access to a locally based specialist stalking advocacy service. Lots of words on a piece of paper there, but what does it really mean? It means that there's somebody locally who knows where to go to get the right levels of support. It may be in terms of counselling, it may be in terms of getting a protective order. Sue will talk about some of these issues in a minute. But the most important thing is that we will know where the refuges are. We will know where the counsellors are. We will know where there may be support networks, where freedom programs are being run. So many different things. You will know how your own locality works. And it's really important for victims of stalking to be signposted to these. We can't make them go, nor should we, but we can at least signpost them and point them in the right direction to where they can get help and support. Now, put simply, there's two purposes for Protection Against Stalking. One is to raise awareness of stalking, and the other is to provide support and an advocacy service. So here today, we're hopefully raising awareness of stalking, and people will hopefully be better informed at the end of this session than maybe they understood at the beginning. And the second thing that Protection Against Stalking is doing is that we provide a local advocacy service. Now, at the moment, that advocacy service is being provided across Kent. Prior to the pandemic, we were providing a face-to-face service with our professionally trained volunteers in West Kent, but in the remainder of Kent, we were providing telephone support to all people who contacted us. So far this year, we have supported over 500 clients. Now, some of those people needed maybe just a little bit of advice. Some needed really detailed advice. And what we've found in the last, particularly the last 6 months, is the cases that we're dealing with have become more complex and they've taken longer to solve. Some largely because of the pandemic, but that's not the only reason for it. So these are the services that Protection Against Stalking provide. The advocacy support. In West Kent, we meet victims face to face, and as we get more and more volunteers, and we hope to provide that face to face service across other areas of Kent too. In the same way as domestic abuse will provide a risk assessment, we provide risk assessments. Some are more screening devices than others, and we'll use DASH, we'll use S-DASH, and we'll use SASH. And I know for some of the police forces, they use something called DARA as well, but we will risk assess, we will provide bespoke safety plans. And as I said earlier, it's really important we know who are the other agencies, who will be able to help in different circumstances. We'll liaise with those agencies. We help our clients obtain injunctions, protective injunctions. Now, of course, Sue will come on to this, I'm sure, but we help with stalking protection orders as well and liaising with the police. We attend court, and that's maybe sometimes easier said than done, particularly at the moment when it needs to be done more remotely than maybe previously. And we work with solicitors. We hold regular meetings with the police single point of contacts, and we're members of a national stalking consortium. The sad part of this is that as far as specialist stalking charities are concerned or providers are concerned, we are one of just 7. So in a small amount of time, Protection Against Stalking has I think, started to make a big difference in Kent, and hopefully will continue to do so. But I think that's probably enough for me. And let's move on now to Sue telling you a little bit more about stalking itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jan. Welcome, everybody, and I'm pleased to be attending this event, this very successful event. Now, following on from what Jan has just mentioned, it's important that we understand actually what stalking is. So when we're talking about stalking, we're talking about a pattern of fixated and obsessive behaviour, which is repeated, it's intrusive, and it causes fear of violence or endangers alarm and distress in the victim. And of course, any type of stalking behaviour is unwanted, and of course it is most definitely persistent. And it's usually orchestrated by one individual, but that one individual could bring others into the stalking behaviour as well. But it's generally one person who begins this actual process. Now, of course, we need to understand the legislation. And as Jan did allude to, Protection Against Stalking were instrumental in the introduction of the stalking offences that are contained within the Protection of Harassment Act. And those are namely Section 2A. And Section 2A talks about a person who enters into a course of conduct that he knows or ought to know will cause alarm and distress to the person that they are harassing or stalking. Section 4A highlights the same type of criteria, but then adds to that of putting a person in fear of violence. It also adds that this type of behaviour would have a major impact on the day-to-day activities of the victim. So this is something we have to be aware of, and in fact, as do police officers, needs to be aware of when they're looking at the particular legislation. Now, from my perspective and the time that I've been dealing with victims of stalking, I would actually say, why do we have Section 2A? Because actually Section 4A, where it talks about putting a person in fear of violence, every victim of stalking that I have dealt with is in fear of violence. And the reason I say this is because they do the most extraordinary things to prevent this fear factor that they're living with. And the things they do to get away from their perpetrators is move home. They change jobs. They go into refuge provision. And of course, when we talk about refuge provision, this is never ever ordinary. It is extraordinary because their lives are totally tipped upside down. That, in my view, is a major impact on that individual. And I would ask, how many women, particularly in refuges currently, have stalking offences being investigated? Because the only reason they are in there is because they are in fear, and they are in fear of an individual finding them. And this individual is going to extreme lengths to locate them. That is stalking. I want to look at some stalking behaviours. And these actually come from an analysis of calls actually to the National Stalking Helpline. I seem to be having a problem. Move up, there we go. And this particular information comes from this piece of analysis of phone calls actually into the National Stalking Helpline, which Jan mentioned is currently run by the Susie Lamplugh Trust. And it highlights here some of the key types of stalking behaviours that they are seeing. And this analysis involved 648 of their clients. So you can see at the top of this, it's the text messages. These are how it tends to start this type of behaviour. Text messages, social network, being able to access emails. And from this bit of research, it's also telling us that during the pandemic, this type of behaviour has without a doubt increased. One thing that did come to light from this bit of research was that half of all the respondents actually highlighted that the perpetrators were actually either accessing them through the workplace or even in fact attended the workplace. So from a stalking behaviour scenario, this means this is actually a high risk indicator. And in fact, the risks of dramatically increase when they actually go to the workplace. So that's something we need to be aware of, and how workplaces need to begin to look at what procedures or processes they would have in place to assist. So how is this cyberstalking continuing? Well, of course it is from the use of technology. And of course, many devices that, or the typical devices that you and I know are the phones, the laptops, the iPads, those type of things. But we also now have to be aware of that there are many devices in the home that can actually be hacked. And these are things such as your lighting, your heating, your electrical goods, perpetrators, and we are seeing this, perpetrators turning music on in the middle of the night when the victim's in bed, there's been a separation. So he's using these type of devices and this technology to continue to control and stalk their victims in this way. When we look at online abuse, this takes many, many forms. Some of you may be very aware of what these types of forms are, but of course we have the hacking type scenario, and this is where someone actually gains access to their equipment and basically begins to change accounts, move accounts, respond to emails. It's quite it needs to be someone who's got some really IT skills to actually do this, but we are seeing it. Then you've got trolling, and the figures that you can see on your screen there are figures again from this analysis that the Susie Lamplugh Trust actually had done. So trolling, this is about posting really insulting comments and things about the victim online. Cyberbullying, this is the intimidation, threatening type languages being posted online. Your sexual harassment, this involves your sexual bullying, basically things like telling jokes of a sexual nature that will undermine and degrade the victims. Message bombing. And I actually began to look at this yesterday, and you can buy a device that you can put onto your system that actually costs, I think the cheapest I saw was 65 pence, where you can message bomb, your victim over and over again with like 100 texts over and over and over. So it's a massive way to actually interrupt victims by doing this. Digitally enable stalking using any form of technology, which is really what we're talking about. And this would be, for someone to carry out this fixated and obsessive type behaviours. And you can see there it's got the 92% report during this bit of research is highlighting the actual mental health of these victims. And from this bit of research, it actually says 92% were impacted in this way, saying that they were scared to talk to people, they've lost their confidence in their work capabilities, which also then tells us the impact this is also having in the workplace. Crying all the time would be another issue. Feeling alone, having sleepless nights would be another. I could go to the online abuse platforms. Now, a lot of you will actually recognize these platforms. And what came from this research actually highlighted that Facebook, WhatsApp, and email are the significant platforms that are being used to stalk and frighten victims. Next slide, please. Thank you. Victims of stalking. So here we've got a number of young ladies some of you may recognise because these were all high-profile cases. I will start with the lady on the left, which is Alice Ruggles. Alice Ruggles was stalked and murdered by her ex-partner. These are all ex-intimate partner type stalking issues, which resulted in the murder of these 4 young women. So Alice Ruggles, she was murdered by Simon Dillon, who was a soldier. He cut her throat. But he went to great lengths when the relationship ended. He was a soldier based up in Scotland, and he would do a 100-mile trip just to watch her. He would look at, take photographs of her, look at the back of the house, leave gifts out the back of the house. And he had a history of previously stalking someone else, which is actually key to us, because 3 out of these 4 women, there was a history of abuse by the perpetrator of other people. We need to begin to recognize when we're dealing with stalking, what is the motivation of the perpetrator? What is the perpetrator's background? Because if there is a background of this, it increases risk. Then we've got the young lady in the middle. This is Shana Grice. Shana Grice was murdered in Sussex by her ex-partner, Michael Lane. And she reported many incidents to the police. And unfortunately, what happened in this scenario is that police actually gave Shana a warning for wasting police time because of the numerous times she'd reported incidents. But, you know, I think there was a real lack of context when this was being viewed. These can never ever be viewed in isolation. They must actually be looked at in the whole context of what is going on. And we've got the lady at the top, which is Holly Gazzard, a hairdresser. She was actually murdered in her place of work, again highlighting the issues about workplace and the risks that are there, and actually what are employers beginning to look at to be able to help and support their staff when in fact this is disclosed to them. What policies and procedures are in place? Because it's important we do have them, because PAS always comes from the point of view that early recognition saves lives. It's vitally important. We recognise it, we look at the context of it, and then we implement strategies to safeguard. And then, of course, we've got the young lady on the right, which is Molly McLaren. Now, she was murdered by Joshua Stimpson, and she was stabbed 75 times in the car park where she'd just come out of the gym. Again, there was some history in relation to that perpetrator with other females, and it's something we need desperately to be aware of. But of course, when we look at stalking, it isn't just about the ex-intimate partners. Here we have a case of Helen Pearson. Helen Pearson was stalked by her neighbour, Joseph Willis. This was in the Cornwall area. And he is what we would call as a resentful stalker. He is the person who approached Helen and said to Helen, "Oh, could we go out for a drink, Helen?" She decided quite politely, "Well, no, thanks for asking, but no." Now, this actually began a 5-year campaign of stalking behaviour towards Helen. These involved threats to kill, sending letters to Helen, and in the letters they were asking her how would she cope if she was attacked. There was a dead cat put on her doorstep. This graffiti, and there's one in the slide there, "Die Helen," and these were actually all over the area she lived, on the pavement, on the sidewalks. They were there, so there were real threats. The problem Helen had is that over that 5-year period, she reported 125 incidents to police about this chap. And again, are these being dealt with in isolation instead of looking at them in the whole context as to what everything is going on? Now, this campaign by this Joseph Willis resulted in him actually attacking her in a local graveyard with a pair of scissors. Now, fortunately, she survived this attack. And I would recommend, for anyone who's looking into stalking to have some understanding of this, because we can often say that stalking is always to do with ex-partners. Well, actually, it's not, and it's certainly not Paz's experience. It's about half and half for us. And the next slide also informs us of this chap who is Bob Courtry. Now, he was a driving instructor, and his learner pupil, who once she'd passed her test, became infatuated with him. And she began a campaign, turning up at his address, following him, following his wife, following other members of the family. And he said that he just felt totally suffocated, and at one point felt he just could not go out. This is the type of stalking behaviour that we are looking at. Now, obviously, for us to look at stalking, it's imperative we understand what risk is. And we certainly don't just risk assess the client. We want to know what motivates the perpetrator to do this. And this helps us understand what risk is. And you can see there are different types of perpetrator. You've got your rejected, the intimacy seeker, the incompetent suitor, the resentful perpetrator, and the predatory perpetrator. And you can see within these categories that the rejected one, the top one, and this is the one which is all these wonderful sessions are taking place, is about raising awareness about domestic abuse as well, that these perpetrators are the most dangerous. These perpetrators are the ones that are losing control, and by losing control, they want to regain it. And there are some that have the mind that if they've lost control, then the only way to regain it is to kill. So this puts this category of domestic abuse high on the list within our stalkers. And of course, when you look at the stats that Jan referred to, 9 out of 10 women who were murdered have been stalked prior to the murder. And that's something we must always have in the back of our mind. Now, I'm not able to go through all these typologies today, but this does give you some indication here. Now, of course, the Alice Ruggles and the Molly McLaren would have come under the rejected stalker scenario. I would suggest the Bob Courtry, the driving instructor, his perpetrator was the incompetent suitor. She was looking for a relationship. She was infatuated by him. But it does not necessarily mean they won't resort to violence. All of these can be quite dangerous. We need to be aware of that under certain circumstances. And then, of course, the Helen Pearson, this is without a doubt the resentful stalker, because he feels is that he's been humiliated. He feels that she believes he's not good enough for her, and this is why he wants this type of revenge, and this is why he then begins to go into this whole method of stalking behaviours towards her. So we must actually begin to think that the motivation part of the stalker is a key thing we need to begin to assess. So the way forward for us then, and as I say, it's our motto, is about early identification and intervention save lives. And a lot of this does come from training to be fully aware. And actually what CIDAS have done with these sessions has been an amazing way to bring this information to the many. So I really do congratulate on this initiative. It's such a good way to do it. We want to build partnerships in the community, obviously in criminal justice, and we are now building that up in various ways, together with victim support as well, and police across Kent. We will continue to raise awareness. And of course, we want to develop our advocacy service across Kent as well. And we're in the process of now beginning to do this. One key thing we've done with the support of Look Ahead is actually have our cyberstalking clinic. And our cyberstalking clinic, we want to bring this to your attention because we want you to access it, to be able to use it. And we've partnered with the cyberstalking helpline so that someone who may be a victim of cyberstalking can actually come to this clinic when we're outside of the COVID situation, because it was always meant to be a face-to-face scenario. But we're doing it online at the moment, and actually it seems to be working in a better way than perhaps we thought it would. And your clients can book onto the cyber clinic, where they'll have an opportunity to speak to a cyber expert and someone from Protection Against Stalking. So we'll help them sort out their devices, look at areas where there might be some problems. Of course, we're very aware of the forensic side of it, so we would not be looking to change things on their laptops or phones. It's about making sure these are reported to police. If they need to be forensically examined, that's what must happen. But often it's just some way that these perpetrators have gained some access, and in fact the client, if they want to, can easily shut that down with the right advice. So I want to leave it there because I think we're actually ready for some questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
So I think we're waiting for Dupsy to come back on, who's been putting the questions together. Here she is.
Yes, Dupsy here.
Here she is.
Thank you so much, Sue and Jan. That's very, very informative. And thank you for all those who sent their questions. Right, just for you to be aware, I don't think we can finish at 3 o'clock because we have so much wonderful question that has been upvoted. So I'm just letting you know now that we might be going slightly 10-15 minutes after. Is that okay with you, Sue and Jan?
Yes, yes.
And I'm sure the participants are happy with that. Thank you so much. Right, let's go straight to the question. I've got the first question, which has got 24 votes, from Sally. Sally's asking, what criteria do the police use to decide the difference between stalking and harassment, and therefore recorded under correct category?
Go on, Sue.
Okay. Well, of course, under the Harassment Act, you're looking at Section 2 or Section 4. And then, of course, stalking, still contained within the Harassment Act, is Section 2A and 4A. This is often clouded, well, it has clouded the issue, in fact, putting the stalking legislation within the Harassment Act. But when we train police officers, we try and assist them to recognise when harassment type of offences come into the stalking behaviour. And when that happens, you need to be looking at the time the person is taking to commit this behaviour. So for example, I alluded to Alice Ruggles and her partner travelling 100 miles round trip. How much time does that take him? You know, how much time does it take to damage someone's car to go to their address? If that is excessive, you're now into the stalking category.
Okay. Thank you.
I think to add to what Sue was saying, I think the other big difference is the obsession and the fixation. I think added to the time it's taken.
Yes.
When behaviour is fixated and they're obsessed with it, then that's when you're looking at stalking. And that's why I think what started off, when stalking was first taught, they looked at stalking as being more serious than harassment. They're totally different. You know, harassment is more dispute-like, whereas stalking is this fixated, obsessive behaviour.
That's right.
Thank you. Right, I've got a question from Max. Is there any research to show whether violence incidents are more closely linked to domestic abuse related or stranger acquaintance related stalking?
Violence actually can occur in all areas of stalking, regardless of the type of perpetrator. And I think we do know that, you know, most murders of women in domestic abuse scenarios, there isn't violence. You know, it's the coercive and controlling behaviour that is the issue, and the losing control. But where you have the stalking offences, then of course, particularly with ex-partners, there's a high risk of violence, as I showed in that little chart. But with some of the other types of perpetrators, there's a less likelihood of violence, and that's why it's actually key we understand what the motivation of the perpetrator is. So we would come from that point, you know, that point of view first.
Thanks, Sue. Right, the next question from myself. There are plans to have online safety workshops for victims to access?
It's something that we've had some thought of, but at the moment, we're obviously in the early days of the cyberstalking. We want to assess the success of that. And of course, we are now working much more remotely and talking to clients, and we have even Zoomed clients a number of times now. So some of that is already on the go, but certainly through the cyberstalking clinic, we pick up clients from that to support them through that as well. So I think they probably could be something like this in the future, yes. Yeah.
You raise a really important point there, Bitsy, and I think, you know, if you look back 9 months, our preference was to do things face to face. I think you know, even in training, you miss something out when in the coffee queue when you're not chatting to the person next to you, and there's something, the networking is lost. But there's also been huge gains over the last 6 months, and we've had to teach ourselves how to use Zoom and a webinar. And who had heard webinar before? So now I think we are more confident, and we're more competent, and it's so important that people understand stalking, and they know where they can go to if they think they are being stalked, to get the best possible safety advice and protection.
Good, thank you. Right, I've got 3 questions from Denise, Emma, and Monica, and I'm trying to put it together. Yeah, it's talking about stalking and harassment. I think people want to know the difference between it. That's from Denise. Emma is asking, how can you quickly establish someone is being stalked? And then Monica is saying, what are the signs that someone is being stalked? So I'm trying to put those 3 questions together. Yeah.
Again, the difference between harassment and stalking is harassment. Well, in fact, harassment can turn into stalking. I think we need to understand that as the first thing. So you might, a stalker might begin the process of the odd texts, you know, the odd telephone calls. It might be the emails. It's when it progresses into something much more sinister. And when you begin to see the fixation, which from harassment and stalking, you have to begin to look at the time the perpetrator is taking on his mission to do this. So if they are to, I mean, some of our stalkers that we're dealing with, it's like they've got a part-time job. You know, they are actually giving so much time to it. That's when we know it's stalking. The odd text here and there does not amount to stalking. But when you know someone is spending this real time, this is a mission for them, that's when you can begin to go from the harassment into the stalking. Then you would begin to look at what is the motivation of this perpetrator. You know, are they fixated? And if somebody is spending that amount of time to be a nuisance to somebody, to put someone in fear, that is the difference between the stalking and harassment. But there are people have difficulties, you know, getting, well, where does the harassment end and where does the stalking begin? I can only say it's that it usually comes from someone who knows a little bit more about this stuff, to be honest, to really narrow it down. But if after today you were speaking to somebody and they said, well, I've had a couple of, you know, emails or a couple of texts, that's harassment, it's not stalking. The difference comes when they're turning up at the workplace, they're turning up at the home, They're sending 100 texts. We had a client last week, 100 texts a day.
Yeah.
This is when it becomes the difference.
Thank you. Anything, Jen?
I'm sorry.
You want to chip in something?
No, I'm going to agree with everything Sue said. We say he.
Could be she.
Yeah, stalking is a gender crime. I mean, 90% of victims are women, and 90% of perpetrators are men. But we've had about 1 in 10. About 10% of our clients are men.
Males. Yeah.
And so it does happen the other way round. And I think, as Sue quite rightly said, the early intervention, the early identification and early intervention does save lives, and understanding what that motivation of the perpetrator is. Why are they doing it? Now, unless we understand that, we cannot work out the risk that the victim is under.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Monica. Are you finding it more difficult to tackle stalking with the development of the latest technology that might be used by many perpetrators?
Shall I take this one?
Yes, go for it, Jan.
I don't think stalking is particularly new. I think it's happened years. But every new piece of technology will enable people to commit the crime in a slightly different way. So I think people have wanted to have revenge. They've wanted loads of different reasons. So stalking, I think, has always been there. And with every new gimmick and gadget, there's another way of being able to exact your revenge or for whatever reason. What was an interesting one is that our behavior of how we use Facebook, how we use Twitter, how we use technology can sometimes be telling a lot of people about our lives that maybe we shouldn't be. And so our own understanding of privacy is quite important. Somebody that I know, they were being followed by using their Garmin tracker. So when they were posting on Facebook and in other places where their run that day had been, it gives great information to a stalker as to people's locations. So I think with every new piece of technology, there's a way of tracking your victims, and for the person who's going to abuse that technology, they will be able to do it. What's important to us, and that's why Sue mentioned the cyber helpline. We work very closely with the cyber helpline, so you could take a cyber expert and a stalking expert, put them together, and we can really help victims identify their own coping strategies, their own technology, and help them to help themselves. So they've got their own hands on their phone, their iPad, their Samsung, whatever else, use the technology and help them to help themselves. Alongside that, you've got the stalking expert who will provide that, the personal safety side of it as well. So, please use the cyber stalking clinic. We're going to be running them once a month. I think the website address was put there. You can make your own appointment. You get a 45-minute appointment. And if you need help after that, then both the cyber helpline and Protection Against Stalking will carry on with that support.
Yeah, we actually, Dupsy, just to know, we have a saying with the technology that it's a new weapon in the arsenal of the stalker.
Wow, wow.
Yeah, that's what we use. Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Now, the next question is from Mary. Do you think that masculinist assumption that women ought to be grateful for male attention underlies the way in which stalking appears not to be taken seriously? I'm aware that women may also be stalkers, so we'll be interested in the gender breakdown of stalkers too, please.
Yeah. Well, I think, as we said earlier, we think 90% of victims are women and 90% of perpetrators are men, but there are male victims and there are female stalkers. But the statistics, and certainly our statistics, 500 cases so far this year in for Protection Against Stalking, and it works out to be about 1 in 10 male victims out of those statistics. As far as you know, what is the thoughts of society? I think when some of these cases, the Alice Ruggles case and the Clare Bernal case and the Holly Gazzard case, have all featured in feature-length programs on television.
Yeah.
And when you start unraveling those cases and you see the opportunities where it could have been stopped, it could have been prevented, somebody could have identified it earlier, then I think it's, I don't think it's necessarily to do with gender. I think it's to do with, you know, we're so busy in loads of other things, we don't see the danger.
Yeah.
But so I do think it's important, you know, if you are the parents of Alice Ruggles, who today speak across England and Wales to tell other people what happened to their daughter, what Bishop Bernal's done for Clare's legacy is so that other parents don't walk in the same shoes that they've had to walk in. And I think it's so important that we understand what stalking is. We understand the risk factors associated with stalking, and then most importantly, we do something about it.
Absolutely.
The victims don't necessarily. Tricia will say, Claire would never describe herself as a victim. She didn't realise she was being stalked. So it's really important we identify it.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. My next question is from Monica again. She's asking, is it difficult to prove stalking to get a conviction?
Is it difficult to prove it?
Yeah.
Actually, it's much of this information, which we've talked about cyberstalking, is contained in computers, which does require a robust investigation and the seizing of equipment. Does it happen all the time? No, but we've had some really good results, you know, with police investigations, and some where perhaps other things could have happened, but we all learn from these. So it can be difficult to prove in some ways, you know, if nobody sees the perpetrator outside the address. But of course, we now go down the route of CCTV and things like, so we begin to use technology to actually prove it. And certainly within PAS, we are looking, you know, for funding for this type of technology that will assist our victims to prove actually what is happening. Brilliant. But it does need a good investigator who will look a little bit outside of you know, the scope of it.
I think that as well is that it takes time. It takes time to investigate, and you've got to have the mindset of, is this stalking? And I think sometimes people start off from the mindset of, oh, it's just a dispute. Sue made, you know, which was talking about the different behaviours. There have been people, you know, if somebody left a bunch of flowers on my doorstep, I might be delighted. But if I was being stalked, I might not be delighted because I knew the stalker had been outside my front door. And so I think it's really important that you understand the mindset is this stalking? Start from the fact it could be stalking and then work downwards, rather than start from, oh, this is just a little argument, and wait for other things. And the other piece of advice is, when you've had hundreds of different occurrences, you've got to put all of those occurrences together. If you're dealing with them all in isolation, you won't see the context that Sue referred to earlier. Right. And that I think it's changing now. I think the police are putting the different cases together, but it's taken a bit of time. But if they're all dealt with separately and by different officers who don't see what other officers are dealing with, you're not going to be able to identify the motivation of the offender.
Actually, my bit of advice around that would be to start with the impact on the victim. Because what you as an investigator, and there's a good example with this of eggs thrown all at the front of somebody's house. You know, the immediate reaction maybe from investigators could be, oh, it's probably kids. But actually a question to the client, what impact has this had on you? Well, actually, I know it's my ex because he knows I have a worry with eggs. I just don't like them. He knows I have this issue. So that's the impact. We have to recognize the impact.
Thank you, Sue. Just for you to know, there are so many questions popping in, and it's 3 o'clock now, but so we'll be adding just a couple of minutes onto this to answer all this wonderful question. Thank you. Right, this question is from Donna. She's asking, do police forces have technology sophisticated to investigate cyberstalking techniques effectively or quickly enough to protect victims or provide reliable enough evidence to stand up in court? That's a very good question. Yeah.
I mean, it's we can only go from our experience and our experience with our clients. I think the technology is out there. Does every police force have it? I actually don't know. But it's more about, I think, the resources, because this is really volume work, and it's the, you know, I'm aware there are waiting times to get phones and laptops and, you know, information from them downloaded. It can take months. COVID hasn't helped that situation because of the resources and things. But we all know the technology's out there. I suppose it's up to individual police forces whether they will invest in that. But this is now what is happening in the world. So you need equally the same type of IT people who understand it and have access to the right technology to actually investigate it.
Yeah, Sue is right. It is about resources. I think Kent Police have got the resources, but sometimes they have more than enough work, and they have to then work out where that time can be best spent. So our ability to identify the highest risk cases will be really important in that.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Jan. This question from Laura, I think you've touched it, but there is a bit of an answer that is needed at the end. It says, how can someone who is experiencing stalking be identified, and when do you think it might be appropriate to suggest they seek help from appropriate authorities?
I think if a victim feels, if a person feels unease about anything that is happening, whether they feel someone who is following them or whether they feel they're having too many texts or they're having strange emails, then they need to ask that question of somebody. Now, as you know, citizens' advice are out there. You could ask the question there. They could even approach police to ask the police on the 101, what do you think this is? I think it's key that they actually begin to ask the question. Anything that makes them feel uneasy means something's not right. And, you know, you all go back to your gut feelings as well. And these are really quite paramount in these type of scenarios. So, I mean, that would be my answer to that. Something that is making you feel uneasy or a bit fearful, you need to be asking what is actually going on here.
Yeah.
The other advice we give, and I'm sure a lot of people who are dealing with domestic abuse will give very similar advice, is keep a diary. Keep a diary, because, you know, from an evidential point of view, that's really important. And I know that Protection Against Stalking, we will give people a diary for them to keep, and as much evidence you can pull together, that would be really helpful. I think one of the other things, just to go back to some of the cyber and technology based, one of the things that many young people hate is having their phone taken off of them. You know, my life is in my phone, and I left it somewhere the other day, and I couldn't get back to it quick enough because you're just so reliant on it. And so when we then say to a young person, well, we'll need to take your phone off of you, somehow they don't want to make a complaint anymore. Now, Protection Against Stalking, I know other charities now have phones that they can give to the client whilst their phone is being reviewed. And I think that's quite important as well.
That's good to know that.
Yeah.
Right. This next question from Max. Are you finding that the offender profile for offenders of predominantly cyber-based stalking is different from that of physical stalking? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, no, because it tends, you know, most stalkers will come face to face with their victims. It's rarely done at a distance for any long periods of time. They might start off with the cyber activity, but there will come a time that there needs to be this seeing the person. And this is where you then get damage to cars, things like that, things being left on doorsteps, you know, things being posted. So, you know, again, it's about what the motivation is of this perpetrator. Some will stick to purely online stuff, but the majority don't, is our experience and from research.
And I think again it goes back to what type of stalker, what's the motivation of the stalker. There are people who just do cyber stalking and are not going to go anywhere near. But and the other thing is that, you know, the people who do cyber stalking and nothing else, it can be just as harmful. The impact it has on the victim, they don't know they're not going to come near them. Every time they pick up the telephone, every time they open the inbox of their computer, they are faced with this person, and it really impacts on their mental health.
Yeah, this leads to the next question from Angela. She said, with the message bumping, some of our customers have called the police and they have been told to block the number on the social media profile. We have been told if the message back saying stop, it said if the message saying stop, you are engaging with the person and therefore no law has been broken. Are the police taking things more seriously? What advice can we give to support the customer? Yeah, I think this person is, Angela is trying to say that the police is asking you to block the number. That if you're contacting them, probably you are engaging with the person. So are the police taking things more seriously? And what other advice can we give to support the customer? Yeah, right.
Again, this does go down to who is this perpetrator? We need to think about that. Excuse me. So this is about, first of all, it's very difficult to, and I don't think we should be advising victims of stalking to block their stalkers on their phones. One, because when you do that, they look at other ways to do stalking, which then could be the more confrontational ways. So that's the first thing, and that's our experience, and again has been subject of some research. So we wouldn't advise them to do that, because the more evidence as that is gathered, the more likelihood police will be able to prosecute anyway. Now, if I know policing, that they come from the point of view, well, how does the perpetrator know that this is unwanted unless you tell them?
Yeah.
Now, that's true in many ways. It's like a non-molestation order, an injunction. The perpetrator needs to know it's in place, or that what they're doing is wrong. Okay, so and that's good evidence so that they do know it. But you know, when you look at the criteria for stalking, the legislation, the criteria of what amounts to stalking really is what the everyday person would think, this is not right. This doesn't, I wouldn't want 20 texts every hour of every day. So I think the question was around, you know, police telling them to block. That's not a good idea, because you lose evidence by that happening, and the stalker begins to look at other methods of doing the stalking. And
can I just add to that? If you take the Alice Ruggles case, for example.
Yes.
That was exactly what happened in that case, where they were advised to block him, and that actually escalated the stalking behaviours. And it goes back to the point you made earlier. Unless you understand what is the motivation of the stalker, you will not understand what the correct safety planning is. And just blocking them could, and has in many cases, Shania Grice would be another good example of that, and Molly McLaren, where the advice given to them actually escalated the risk that the victim was under.
Okay. Wow, good. I'll just try and round up with the last two questions. I'm really sorry, participators, if I cannot answer your question. Sue, I think a session like this should come up again. What do you think?
Yes, we'd be happy to do something.
This 1 hour is not enough at all. Right. Now, why is there no specialist in the police?
Well, I think there are beginning to be specialists in the police. Stalking, I believe, is now being taken more seriously. an example of that recently is that if you have a high-risk domestic abuse case, it will go before something called MARAC, as you were describing earlier, Dupsy.
That's correct.
And for high-risk domestic abuse cases, which may also be stalking cases, they can obviously go to MARAC. But if you think of the Helen Pearson case, which was a neighbour, and you think of the driving instructor, they couldn't go to MARAC because they're not domestic abuse cases. And so Kent Police are now doing a MARAC-type process for the high-risk stalking cases. And I think that's a huge step forward. So they now are identifying it. But it's going to take time. It's going to get time for stalking to better be understood. There are now single points of contact in most areas of the county. I think they have to do it in addition to their day job. So I think that they're given a lot of, they've got a lot of work on their plates if you're really going to capture the cases of stalking, to make sure that the investigations which could and should have taken place are taking place. But I think police are beginning to take it much more seriously.
Yeah, I think I saw a question, an answer pop up from, I'm sorry if I can't remember your name, that they're a specialist in Kent Police.
I think it was John Connor who said it, but he was right. Yeah.
All right then, good. Right. I wouldn't say last but not the least, because there are more other wonderful questions there, but unfortunately, time is kind of, I would say, on our side, not against us. What support is out there for people who show stalking behavior, particularly those who may have mental health issues?
Right. Mental health can form part of a number of stalkers' makeup. Not the rejected stalker, the ex-intimate stalker. That's not usually the case, but it can come up in other types of stalking where someone with mental health or psychotic issues can become very infatuated by someone. But what I would say to anyone listening here, if there are mental health issues, it increases risk. It's not decreasing risk. I've had a couple of cases where, oh, it'll be fine, because this person's got mental health problems. Well, actually, that increases the risk. So we need to be aware of that. And yes, some stalkers do have a mental health issue, and that is why they're doing the stalking. But we can pick that up. And in fact, there's been one case, it's a couple of years ago now, though, that we, which was in West Kent, and we liaised with Highland House, who we knew this perpetrator was involved with Highlands House, a support service for mental health. So we will try and do that as well. But primarily, there are offences committed, and this is where we would then obviously be asking police to look at that as well.
Wow. I'm tempted to ask this last question from Caroline. She's saying, would you like to see a national register for domestic abuse perpetrators similar to the sex offenders register? And have you signed the petition?
Yeah. Do you know, I meant to mention this, and I didn't. And the reason I say an absolute yes, and I've signed the petition, and I am so disgusted it's not in the domestic abuse bill. Okay. It should be. It's not. And because if you look at the cases that we've referred to, particularly the ex-intimate ones, had there been that register in place, there would have been a process to identify the previous behaviour of the perpetrator at a much earlier stage. And that really does inform the risk. And this is where, when we look at the murder timeline, and I am now, actually, I may not have been some years ago, but I am now a real believer that most of these cases, particularly domestic abuse cases, can be predicted if you have someone looking at this information at a very early stage, because you can see there's a process to these things. And actually, the background of the perpetrator is the first thing you need to look at.
Absolutely. So much, Sue. Dan, do you want to say something for the very...
No, I think what Sue said is right. I think if you take nothing else from today's session, you need to understand the motivation of the perpetrator And once you've got that, then you stand a chance of being able to put the right protections in place.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jan and Sue. Well, thank you, Jan and Sue. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure something we will all be going away thinking about. Thanks to everyone who asked questions. And I'm really sorry that I can't really publish or answer all your questions. I believe Sue and Jan is going to, with the organizer, bring something like this again. Right, all the questions you've asked today and answered have really added to the conversation. A recording of this webinar will be made available to you shortly. If you've enjoyed this event, please do note that there is still time to register for the upcoming webinars, so your conference journey doesn't need to end here. Go to www.daeverybodiesbusiness.org to register. We can also keep the conversation going with the hashtag, if you have a Twitter handle or on your social network, hashtag DAEverybodiesBusiness and hashtag #NoCSpeakOut. If the talk today has raised anything with you personally and you would like to find out more about the services available, please visit www.domesticabuseservices.org.uk, where you can find out more about how to refer into your local service. And from me to you today, thank you so much for this wonderful time and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
We are off the Tier 3. Shop wisely and keep safe. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.